The bell above the door jingled sharp, too sharp, cutting through the soft hum of morning in the Harbour View coffee house. A young barista froze mid-pour, the steam rising from the latte, swirling in the sunlight through the front window. Every fork lifted, every whispered conversation paused. At the far corner, an elderly man shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around the worn handle of a cane. His jacket was faded sleeves frayed the insignia of a long-forgotten deployment, faint against the fabric. He looked up only once, and the world seemed to bend slightly under the weight of the stairs. "Move along, old man. This isn't your place." The voice came from the other side of the room. Sharp, casual, a cruel ease in the tone. 3 boys, barely 18, leaned against the counter, smirking. One nudged the other eyes, glinting with mischief. He kicked the cane, sending it clattering across the hardwood floor. The man did not flinch. He did not reach for it immediately. He exhaled slowly, almost measured, like every motion was weighed, every breath calculated. He lowered himself, picked up the cane, and straightened with the kind of stiffness only years of discipline could forge. The boys laughed. One swatted the back of his head with a menu. "What you think this is Vietnam? Wake up, Rambo." The quip drew more laughter, more smirks, but the room held its breath. No one moved. The waitress paused, a hand hovering over a plate of pastries. The manager, a man in his 50s with slicked-back grey hair, leaned against the doorway, eyes darting between the intruders and the man who barely moved. For an hour he sat. The coffee in front of him cooled into a murky brown that reflected more than light. It reflected patience, endurance, a quiet storm. His eyes traced the windows, the ceiling, the misplaced objects on tables, but never rested on the boys. His shoulders bore invisible scars, the weight of battles no one in this room had fought. He was an old soldier in every sense, trained to observe, trained to endure, trained to wait. The door opened again, and the light shifted. The smell of leather and ozone followed 6 men into the room. Boots clapped against the hardwood in rhythm, the sound heavy, deliberate. They were older than the boys, late 30s to early 40s, solid muscle under faded jackets. A leather patch on one sleeve read, "North Atlantic Veterans Club." Another bore a tattoo, United States Navy SEAL, Semper Fi. No words, only glances. The camera of perception seemed to slow as they scanned the room. Every head turned. Every breath became aware of the presence that had entered. Bob. The tallest one stepped forward, shaking the old man's hand with both of his. Firm, unyielding, respect in motion. Bob Henderson looked up surprised, and yet a faint smile broke across his face. "Didn't expect to see you here." The man nodded. "We never forget family." The tension shifted. Subtle at first, like the wind before a storm. Their arrival wasn't about confrontation. It was about acknowledgement, about justice, about balance. The boys, 3 of them still seated near the counter, turned toward the new arrivals, and their bravado began to falter. "You all got a problem with veterans?" The question was calm but sharp. Ice in a room that had been warm with tension. The tallest boy swallowed, glanced at his friends. Nervous laughter broke, thin and brittle. "We were just joking," one said. The SEAL's eyes did not waver. Joking, the voice low, dangerous. Smacking an old man with a menu is your idea of fun. One chair tipped over. A fork clattered. Their feet shuffled. We didn't mean nothing. We'll go. But the seal blocked the path, their stance firm, deliberate, moral in weight. Not until you apologize. Properly. To him. The boys' faces drained of color. One by one they turned toward Bob Henderson, now sitting with a quiet, almost regal patience. I'm sorry, sir, mumbled to the first. Didn't mean any disrespect, said the second, eyes fixed on the floor. The last whispered, sorry. Bob studied them. He saw fear tangled with ignorance, arrogance dissolved into humility. Really? His voice was soft, but it carried authority. Remember this, he said. You never know the battles someone has fought. The seals watched the boys shuffle toward the exit, humbled, shaken. One of them stepped forward to the counter, placed a stack of bills with a thud that echoed in the quiet room. Breakfast on us, he said. And next time someone lays a hand on him, we'll be here. Bob lifted his coffee eyes, misting. The steam rose like a halo. For a moment he felt visible again. The room exhaled, not in relief, but in understanding. Respect, long denied, had returned in waves. And yet the story had a second layer, a subplot that no one anticipated. From the corner, a young waitress Emily watched with wide eyes. She had seen the boys before in different contexts, taunting other patrons. She realized she had been complicit in their silence, and something shifted inside her. A pang of guilt and courage battled in equal measure. She straightened, gripping the edge of the counter, ready to speak if necessary. The seals glanced at her briefly, noting the change, acknowledging that the ripple of justice could extend beyond the immediate actors. Outside the window, the morning sun climbed, spilling warm light across the café. The old veteran's presence, the young woman's, awakening the humbled boys and the silent witnesses, all became part of a new equilibrium. It was quiet but electric. The kind of morning where a single act of courage reverberates farther than anyone can measure. And in that quiet, the lesson was unmistakable. Courage is not loud, authority is not always seen, and respect, when restored, changes everyone in the room. If this story moved, you take a moment to reflect. Reach out to someone you respect. Tell them their service matters, and never underestimate the quiet power of standing up for what is right. The sound of the cafe door opened again, quieter this time, almost hesitant, but it carried a presence that immediately drew every gaze. A man in his mid-40s, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a crisp navy blazer and faded jeans, stepped in. His movements were deliberate, measured. He didn't glance around, didn't acknowledge the stares. He only looked at Bob Henderson. The young barista, still trembling from the morning's chaos, fumbled with the espresso machine. The milk frother hissing louder than it should have, the smell of steamed milk mingling with the tension in the air. "Morning, Sarge," the man said, voice low but firm, carrying weight even in casual speech. Bob looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly, a faint recognition passing through the wrinkles of his face. "You," he said, surprise tempered by a cautious smile. The man nodded, stepping closer, scanning the room in one fluid motion. "We heard about your morning," he said, eyes locking on Bob's with quiet intensity. "We're here to make sure it ends differently." Emily, the waitress from the corner, felt her pulse quicken. She had never seen someone command the room with such subtle authority. She shifted her weight fingers, tightening around a tray, unsure whether to serve or step back. Across the café, the three teenagers sat frozen, their smirks replaced by an uncomfortable awareness, their earlier bravado cracking like brittle ice. The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, flipping it open with a swift precision. "I need to know exactly what happened," he said. He was calm, but the quiet command in his tone made the room hold its breath. Bob's hand shook slightly as he raised his coffee, the cup now lukewarm. "They were out of line," he said, softly, voice steady, despite the tremor in his hands. "But it isn't just about what they did to me. It's about what's allowed to happen in here." A ripple of movement passed through the cafe. Emily glanced at the manager, Harold, who had been silent since the confrontation. He adjusted his glasses nervously, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. The boys shifted uncomfortably, one tugging at his sleeve, the others exchanging fleeting glances, realizing that this morning had escalated far beyond their intent. The man who Bob now recognized as Lieutenant Commander Marcus Allen, a retired SEAL who had served alongside him years ago, began walking toward the counter, scanning the room like a predator assessing territory. "These boys," Marcus said, nodding toward the teenagers, "they need to understand the difference between fear and respect. They need a demonstration." He crouched, slightly lowering his stance, so it wasn't threatening, but it radiated control authority. Emily caught her breath. She could feel the tension coiling like a spring ready to release. One of the boys, the tallest, spoke up nervously. We didn't know," he stammered, eyes darting between Marcus and Bob. "It was just a joke. We didn't mean anything." Marcus's eyes were sharp, unyielding. A joke. His tone was calm, deadly in its precision. "Your joke could have broken him. Every laugh, every nudge, every careless glance it builds. And one day, someone won't just sit quietly." Bob shifted in his seat cane, resting against his knee. His eyes scanned the room, noting the subtle reactions, the barista's wide eyes, the manager's clenched fists, the other patrons' hushed whispers. No one moved. No one dared. The cafe felt smaller, the walls tighter, as if the very air had thickened. Marcus straightened, turned slightly toward the boys. "You will apologize, all three of you. Not just words, but acknowledgement. Not just now, but you will carry this lesson forward." "Understood." The boys' faces drained of color. The tallest nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. We're sorry, sir. We didn't mean to hurt anyone." The second whispered, I apologize, sir." The last, barely audible, muttered, "Sorry, sir." Bob's gaze softened slightly, a flicker of pride passing across his lined face. "That's a start," he said. Marcus nodded once, sharply, acknowledging the moment without ceremony. "Emily," he said, turning toward her. "You've been silent too long. Tell them what they've done wrong." Her voice trembled slightly, but she stepped forward, placing the tray on the nearest counter. They made fun of him. They mocked him for being old, for being a veteran. They didn't see him as a person. They didn't see his life, his sacrifices. The barista, still fumbling with the espresso machine, peeked over the counter, eyes wide. Harold, the manager, cleared his throat. "I should have stepped in," he admitted, voice small, regretful. Marcus's gaze swept the room, landing on him. And you, he said, your inaction made this possible. You've been entrusted to protect, not just serve. Understand? Harold nodded quickly, swallowing hard. From the corner, a woman in her 60s sitting alone with a newspaper raised her hand slightly. They should learn more than just to apologize, she said. They need to understand respect. Respect for history, for those who came before. Marcus's eyes softened for a brief moment, acknowledging her words. She's right, he said. This isn't about punishment alone. It's about perspective. Lessons learned too late are worse than pain inflicted. The boys shuffled toward the door, heads bowed, each step deliberate, heavy with newfound humility. One knocked over a chair in haste, muttering under his breath. Bob watched them go, coffee cup trembling in his hand, a sense of quiet closure settling over him. Marcus rested a hand lightly on Bob's shoulder. You're visible now, he said. Not invisible. And that visibility matters. But just as the tension seemed to release, the subplot emerged. A delivery driver, a young man named Tyler, who had been standing outside waiting for a package, stepped inside. He had seen the boys arrive, had heard the mockery, and now watched the seals. His eyes were sharp, calculating. He approached the counter, glancing at Marcus and Bob. You're all in, he asked quietly. Marcus nodded understanding immediately. Tyler pulled from his backpack a small camera, not for recording the incident, but for a digital mapping project he was developing for community awareness about harassment in public spaces. Your story, Tyler said, it's going to reach more than this street. People need to see how it unfolds, who acts and who stays silent. Bob looked at him, brow furrowed. And if it spreads, Tyler smiled faintly. Then the lesson travels farther than anyone can stand. The 6 seals shifted subtly, forming a protective semicircle around Bob. Not aggressive, but signaling that interference would not be tolerated. Emily, now emboldened, moved behind the counter, hands gripping the edge, ready to intervene if the boys tried to sneak back. The café was silent again, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like a held breath waiting for the next move. Then the final twist, a local news reporter, having followed a tip about the morning disturbance, walked in. Camera rolling, microphone, live eyes scanning the room. So, ma'am, can we get a statement? He asked. The boys froze. Marcus raised a finger, signaling no panic. Bob set his cup down, slowly. Gaze sweeping the room, taking in the faces, the tension, the unspoken judgments. He leaned slightly forward. What you've seen here isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's overlooked, dismissed, or mocked because of age, experience, or service. This he said, gesturing to the boys. The café, the people frozen in place. This is a reminder that respect is owed, not granted. The reporter nodded, scribbling furiously. Emily's eyes were wide, filled with awe. Tyler raised his camera, slowly capturing the quiet dignity of the moment. The boys, still standing near the door, looked at each other. Realization dawning that their morning of mockery had transformed into a lesson that would echo far beyond the cafe walls. Bob lifted his coffee once more, the liquid now barely warm, and exhaled. Marcus stepped back, eyes scanning, protective yet respectful. The cafe's patrons, previously passive, now whispered, nodded, some teary-eyed, some stunned into reflection. Outside, the morning sunlight reflected off the wet pavement, shimmering in streaks across the windows, as if the world itself acknowledged the shift. It was quiet, but electric. A single act of courage, a small band of protectors, a witness ready to amplify the truth, and the ripple of justice had begun. No loud proclamations, no violence, only the authority of presence, the weight of experience, and the undeniable power of being seen. And somewhere in the back of the café, Emily whispered to herself, "Maybe it's never too late to stand up." The air vibrated with unspoken agreement, the café alive with the sense that this morning would be remembered not for the laughter, not for the cruelty, but for the courage that refused to stay invisible. The door chimed again, softer this time, almost timid, yet it carried a weight that made heads turn. A black SUV idled outside on the wet pavement, tires crunching against the gravel as if announcing its arrival. Inside the café seemed to inhale every patron, sensing the shift in energy. A man in his late 50s stepped out, tall, broad, his coat buttoned but slightly worn at the edges, sleeves showing signs of long use. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the room like a hawk before settling on Bob Henderson. "Bob," he said, voice deep but calm, carrying authority without need for volume. Bob's gaze lifted from the lukewarm coffee eyes, narrowing as recognition flickered across his lined face. "Marcus." He murmured a mixture of surprise and relief, threading through his voice. Marcus Allen, now standing beside him, nodded toward the SEALs, who straightened imperceptibly, their eyes alert but restrained. The boys at the counter shuffled uneasily. Their earlier bravado had dissolved into a fragile shell of guilt. But Marcus's gaze pinned them in place. "Step back," he said. The words were soft, measured, yet in them was a promise of consequence. The tallest boy swallowed hard. We didn't mean anything," he stammered. Marcus's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with cold scrutiny. "Jokes have consequences," he said, his tone slow and deliberate. "Do you understand the weight of your actions?" Bob shifted in his chair, the cup of coffee trembling slightly in his hands. He watched the room carefully, noting the subtle reactions. The barista's wide-eyed focus, the manager. Harold's knuckles tightening around a notepad. The older patrons leaning slightly forward in anticipation. Each reaction, a piece of the human puzzle, each motion and glance, carrying the story forward. Marcus stepped closer to the boys, gaze sharp. "You will apologize. Each of you. Not for show, not for fear. You will acknowledge what you did and understand why it was wrong." The room held its breath. One boy's hand twitched. "I'm sorry, sir," he mumbled. The second whispered, "Didn't mean to disrespect you, sir." The third, barely audible, "Sorry, sir." Bob's eyes softened. "It's a start," he said, voice low but carrying authority. Emily, the waitress, had been silent all morning, her fingers tight around the edge of a tray. Now she stepped forward, shoulders straightening, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "They mocked him," she said. "They laughed at his age, at his service. They didn't see him as a person. They didn't see what he gave for this country." Her gaze flicked to the SEALs, who nodded imperceptibly, acknowledging her courage. The cafe door opened once more, and a man in his 40s entered, thin but upright suit, slightly rumpled from travel. His presence alone drew the attention of the room without effort. Tyler, the young delivery driver, stepped into the light camera in hand, scanning the room with careful attention. "I want to document this," he said softly, eyes locking with Marcus's. "Not to shame anyone, but to show how this unfolds, how people act, how courage manifests." Bob's eyes lingered on Tyler, a faint smile crossing his face. "Sometimes being seen is the most powerful act," he said. The barista's hands shook slightly as she adjusted the coffee machine, spilling a small stream of foam, but no one noticed. All eyes were focused forward. Marcus gestured towards the boys again. "You're leaving now. Remember this. Remember how quickly things can turn when respect is absent and courage is present." The boys shuffled toward the door, one knocking over a chair in haste. Each step measured, each movement heavy with new understanding. Bob watched, a sense of quiet satisfaction in his chest. Emily shifted, moving behind the counter, hands clasped tightly, ready to intervene if the boys tried to return. Her eyes met Bob's briefly, and in that glance a silent acknowledgement passed between them. Courage has a way of inspiring even those who have been passive. The SEALs formed a subtle protective semicircle around Bob, their posture calm, but their presence unyielding, signaling that interference would be met with consequences. Outside, the morning sun was climbing higher, reflecting off the puddles left by an early drizzle. A soft wind rattled the cafe's front awning. The room held its quiet electricity, every small gesture magnified by the tension of the moment. Patrons who had previously remained silent now whispered among themselves, some nodding in agreement, others clearly unsettled by the display of accountability. Then a new layer of conflict emerged. A local shop owner passing by the cafe window stepped inside, curiosity written across his lined face. He approached cautiously, hands raised slightly. "I saw what happened outside," he said. "I want to make sure this doesn't continue. Some of these kids have been harassing folks in the neighborhood all week." Bob looked at him, eyes calm but sharp. "It's already been addressed," he said. "But awareness is never too late." Marcus's gaze swept the room. "This morning isn't just about one incident," he said. "It's about setting a standard. One act can ripple outward. People notice. People learn. People change." He looked at Bob, then Emily, then the quiet crowd. And sometimes the lesson is as much for those watching as for those involved. Emily took a deep breath. "I never thought I'd speak up," she said, softly, voice barely above the hum of the espresso machine. "But seeing them with him, I realized I had to." Bob nodded. "Courage doesn't need permission," he said. "It just needs a moment to manifest." Outside the cafe, the SUV door opened again. Marcus stepped out, pulling a small notebook from his coat, flipping it open. He jotted a few notes, his eyes scanning the street. "We need to be vigilant," he said quietly. "Situations like this don't resolve themselves. We can't always be here, but awareness can travel faster than presence." Tyler adjusted his camera, capturing the light reflecting off the wet pavement, the steam rising from the cafe, the quiet determination etched into every face. Inside, the remaining patrons were now alert eyes flicking toward Bob and Emily, a collective realization settling over them. Respect is earned, Courage is recognized. Actions have consequences. Marcus nodded once, a gesture so slight it might have been missed, but it carried weight. "Let this be remembered," he said. "Not as a morning of confrontation, but as a morning of accountability, presence, and human decency." Bob lifted his coffee again, lips curling into a faint smile. His hands steady now. "Visible or invisible, it matters not," he said softly. "What matters is standing firm." And today, everyone here bore witness. The door chimed one final time. Patrons turned baristas. Paused, the manager straightened, and the wind carried the faint scent of autumn leaves through the café. Bob exhaled slowly, eyes closing for a brief moment, feeling the shift in energy, the acknowledgement that even small acts of courage can ripple outward in ways no one can fully anticipate. Emily glanced at him, her hands still gripping the counter. "Do you think it's enough?" she asked quietly. Bob opened his eyes, looking at the space around him. The face is the aftermath of confrontation and resolution. "It's never just enough," he said. "But it's a start. And that start changes everything." Tyler lowered his camera, smiling faintly. "Then let's make sure it's seen," he said. Outside, the light expanded, spilling warmth over the street. The café, once ordinary, now held the memory of a morning where courage, respect, and human dignity had collided and left their mark. Bob lifted the cup one last time, inhaling the faint aroma of coffee and quiet victory, and whispered to himself, "Let them remember this." The café held its breath alive with the echo of that thought, a reminder that justice in its simplest form often begins with the courage to be present. The morning had started ordinary. It would end remembered. And the lesson would travel far beyond the walls of Harborview Coffee House. The morning light slanted through the cafe windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the worn wooden floors. Bob Henderson sat near the counter, cane resting against his chair, coffee cooling before him. His eyes, steady and measured, tracked every movement in the room. Patrons whispered in hushed tones, glancing at the seals and the small group of teenagers who still lingered near the doorway, unsure whether to leave or linger, their earlier bravado replaced with anxiety. Marcus Allen leaned against the wall, notebook in hand, eyes sweeping the cafe. Every twitch, every glance, every small gesture was catalogued. He didn't need to speak. Presence alone commanded attention. Emily wiped down a table slowly, deliberately, her hands trembling slightly, but her posture rigid. The morning's events had shifted something in her, a mixture of awe and newfound courage. A bell rang again. But this time the door opened for a woman in her mid-40s, dressed in a simple coat and scarf, hair pulled back into a practical bun. She froze the moment she saw Bob surrounded by the seals and the lingering tension. Her hands tightened around a leather briefcase as she scanned the room, noting the stillness of the barista and the manager, Harold, who had been silent since the first confrontation. "Mr. Henderson." Her voice was low, cautious. Bob looked up, eyebrows raising. "Yes, and you are." She took a hesitant step forward. "I'm Claire Whitman," she said. "I own the building across the street. I've seen the group outside the commotion. I thought you might need assistance." Bob tilted his head, measuring her words the way they hung in the air with intent. "Assistance," he asked. Her gaze faltered briefly under the weight of his eyes. If you need backup or someone to speak on your behalf, sometimes authority is louder than presence alone. Bob nodded, slightly appreciation tempered by caution. Sometimes, he said. The seals shifted subtly eyes, tracking the newcomers, hands near belt lines but relaxed, as if acknowledging Claire without needing conversation. The teenagers stiffened, sensing that a new layer of accountability had arrived, a layer they hadn't anticipated. Emily, watching from behind the counter, let out a small breath. Claire's arrival added tension, but also validation. She realized she wasn't alone in her recognition of what had transpired. She adjusted the napkins on the counter, almost unconsciously preparing to speak, if needed, her knuckles whitening around the edges. Claire moved closer to the counter, her eyes fixed on the group of boys. I need to understand exactly what happened, she said, voice controlled, not accusatory, but carrying weight. The tallest boy swallowed hard, glance flicking to his friends, then to the seals. He stammered, We were just messing around. We didn't mean. Marcus's gaze cut him off. Sharp, precise. You did it. Words, actions, intent, consequence. You chose disrespect. Bob shifted in his seat, noting the subtle shift in energy. Claire's presence amplified the accountability, transforming the café into more than a witness space. It became a tribunal of ethics, morality, and social awareness. The boys' eyes darted, sweat forming along foreheads, and their voices caught in throats too dry for words. Emily stepped forward, then voice low but firm. You mocked him, she said. You laughed. You didn't see the life behind the face. You didn't see what he's done. You didn't see sacrifice. Her gaze swept the room, landing on Harold. And you, she said, voice now stronger, you allowed it to happen? Harold shifted uncomfortably. Jaw tight, eyes flicking to Bob, then to Marcus, then to Claire. I didn't know what to do, he admitted. Claire nodded once, sharply. Exactly. That's the point. Recognizing inaction is the first step. But action must follow. You need to ensure this doesn't happen again. Her gaze swept the café, measuring, calculating, conveying authority in subtle, unspoken ways. The teenagers swallowed hard, shifting on their feet, realizing the weight of oversight had doubled the consequences, potentially more severe than they'd imagined. Outside, the hum of traffic pressed against the windows, the city waking slowly. A local news photographer, drawn by the bell chimes and subtle commotion, entered cautiously, camera ready. He crouched near the back, capturing the scene without drawing attention. Marcus caught the subtle movement of his lens, nodded imperceptibly, acknowledging the extension of witness. Emily's pulse quickened. Every click, every shutter was now amplifying the lesson, reaching beyond the walls of the café. Bob set his coffee down, exhaling slowly, a deliberate motion, letting the room absorb the pause. Courage, he said, voice low but firm, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, deliberate, and measured. But it's always noticed eventually. Marcus's eyes flicked to the teenagers. Do you understand that? The tallest nodded, still trembling, a flicker of comprehension in his eyes. Claire stepped closer to Bob, lowering her voice. You've done what most won't. You've stood in place while the world ignored you. You've turned observation into presence and presence into authority. That's rare, and it inspires others. Bob's lips curved into a faint smile. It's only meaningful if it changes something he said. Suddenly, a sound from the street drew everyone's attention. A cyclist delivery bag slung over his shoulder paused outside the window, peering in curiously. Tyler, the young man with the camera, stood near the door, adjusting angles, capturing the tension, the subtle micro-expressions. Claire's eyes softened slightly as she noted his diligence. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "the smallest observers carry the largest lessons forward." The café was silent, alive with anticipation. Each patron, barista manager, teenager, SEAL, and newcomer felt the shift. The old veteran's authority no longer silent, the lesson reaching beyond the immediate confrontation. Bob leaned back slightly, cane steady eyes, sweeping the room one last time. "Respect," he said. "Voice firm isn't granted. It's earned. And sometimes it's reclaimed." Emily let out a quiet breath, feeling the tension ease slightly, but remain potent, a coiled spring of awareness and newfound courage. Harold, borstal but attentive, nodded slowly, understanding that inaction carried weight, heavier than he had realized. The teenagers' heads remained bowed, their earlier mischief replaced by comprehension that some lessons come not from fear alone, but from witnessing integrity. Marcus stepped forward, voice calm, resolute. "The moment has passed, but the lesson travels. Remember, accountability doesn't end when you leave this room. It travels with you. Every action echoes, every choice leaves a mark." Bob lifted his hand slightly, signaling agreement, a subtle gesture that carried years of experience and authority. Claire glanced at him, the morning sunlight catching the edges of her glasses, illuminating a faint sheen of reflection. "And some marks," she said, voice quiet but penetrating, "carry forward in ways others cannot predict. You've set a standard here today." Outside, the wind shifted, rustling fallen leaves across the sidewalk, echoing faintly through the open door. Patrons and onlookers exhaled almost imperceptibly, the hum of normal life resuming, but changed forever, touched by the morning's lesson. Emily straightened shoulders back, the tremor in her hands gone, replaced with resolve. Tyler adjusted the camera one final time, nodding to himself as he realized the moment captured more than just conflict. It captured clarity, consequence, and courage. Bob sipped the coffee lukewarm now, and exhaled slowly, letting the steam rise into the morning light. Marcus watched the room, vigilant yet relaxed eyes, scanning for subtle changes. Claire moved toward the door, briefcase in hand, nodding once to Bob. "You've done more than stand," she said. "You've made them see." The café hummed softly with activity, now the normal rhythm restored, but layered with awareness, reflection, and a subtle reverence for the quiet strength that had dominated the morning. Bob looked at Marcus, at Emily, at Claire, at the lingering teenagers, and finally, with a faint smile, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The lesson would travel far beyond this small café, beyond these walls, beyond the city streets. The bell above the door chimed once more as a customer entered. Bob lifted his coffee, eyes steady. Presence, integrity, courage, quiet, measured, and undeniable. The ripple had begun, and nothing would erase it. The late morning sunlight slanted sharply across the cafe floor, glinting off the brass handles of the front door as it opened with a deliberate push. A group of 3 men entered, middle-aged, sharply dressed, but with a wary caution in their gait. They scanned the room immediately, eyes landing on Bob Henderson, sitting calmly at his table cane, resting against his chair, coffee untouched. The SEALs shifted slightly, their presence a quiet barrier, muscles tensing with subtle authority, ready if needed. The men hesitated near the entrance, glancing at the teenagers who had been lingering, now hunched, murmuring among themselves. One of the newcomers, taller with graying hair at his temples, spoke first. Bob Henderson. His voice was measured, carrying both respect and curiosity. Bob looked up, gaze steady. "That's me," he said. The man nodded once, briskly. "I'm Frank Lawson. This is Detective Avery and Officer Klein. We need to talk to you. About this morning." Bob's eyes flicked toward the cafe door, noting the pause in the usual ambient sounds. The barista stopped wiping counters. The hum of the espresso machine softened. About the incident, he asked, voice calm but precise. Frank leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice. "It's more than an incident. There's been a report filed. Witnesses video, all of it. We want to understand exactly what happened before it escalates further." Emily, still behind the counter, felt a shiver run down her spine. She had never imagined law enforcement showing up over a disruption in a local cafe. She adjusted a napkin dispenser, fingers tightening around it, listening intently to every word. Marcus and the SEALs exchanged a glance, subtle acknowledgement passing between them. Nothing would threaten Bob today, but the world outside was beginning to notice. Detective Avery, a tall woman with a sharp gaze and tightly pulled back hair, stepped closer. "We've reviewed the reports from the cafe security camera and witness statements. Can you walk us through your version? From the beginning?" Bob leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing. "From the beginning," he repeated, voice calm. "Fine. But it's not just about what you've seen. It's about what you didn't see." The silence, the hesitation, the choices made by those who could have acted and didn't. The men nodded, pens poised, tablet screens glowing as they prepared to document every word. Avery's gaze was steady, unblinking, and Klein, younger but alert, shifted his weight. Arms crossed, eyes following every subtle movement. Bob's lips tightened, his hands gripping the cup, the ridges of his fingers pressing into the ceramic. The boys, 3 of them, decided to mock me. One kicked my cane, another called out names, one swatted my shoulder with a menu, each action deliberate. They believed it was harmless. Frank interjected, and no one intervened. Bob shook his head slowly. "No." The barista froze. The manager hesitated. Other patrons pretended to look at their phones, at their drinks, at anything but the reality unfolding before them. He paused, letting the words settle. Fear, indifference, complicity. That was their choice. And their lesson has just begun. Avery raised an eyebrow. "You're saying what happened was as much about inaction as it was about the boys' behavior?" Bob nodded once, sharply. "Exactly. And that's why I did what I did. Not for revenge, not for spectacle, but to reclaim presence, to make visible what others ignore." the youngest seal. A man with a trimmed beard spoke quietly. They saw the lesson. It's over. You've restored balance here. Bob's eyes flicked to him briefly, a small nod of acknowledgement. Outside, a light wind rattled leaves against the window, punctuating the tension in the room. Avery made a quick note, fingers tapping rapidly. "We'll need statements from the café staff," she said. "And the teens. They need to corroborate the sequence." Emily felt a sudden pressure, realizing she would be asked to speak. Her hands trembled slightly, but she squared her shoulders. "I'll tell the truth," she said, voice low but firm. They mocked him. I froze at first. I didn't know what to do. But now I understand. It wasn't harmless. It was cruel. Bob glanced at her eyes, softening just a fraction. "Thank you. Recognition is the first step toward change." The teenagers still near the doorway had sunk lower into themselves, their previous arrogance gone. One spoke, voice shaking. We didn't know. We thought it was a joke." Bob's gaze was steady, piercing, not angry, just measured. "Intent does not erase impact. Every action leaves a mark. Remember that." Frank's pen paused mid-motion. "And the seals." They arrived, intervened. Bob exhaled slowly, eyes drifting toward Marcus and the others, who nodded imperceptibly. They restored order, yes, but the lesson is larger than them. Their presence amplified the accountability. The courage, the observation, the understanding that was what truly mattered. Klein adjusted his stance unconsciously, leaning forward. "So you orchestrated visibility to ensure accountability." Bob's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not orchestrated. Observed. Positioned. Presence matters. And timing. The world notices when courage and authority align, even quietly." Avery's pen stopped. She looked up. "And what about the parents, the bystanders, the other patrons?" Bob's gaze swept the room slowly. Witnesses see more than they think. They remember patterns, micro-expressions, hesitation, resolve. One morning, one act of presence can ripple through their day, their choices, their respect for others. Marcus stepped forward, slightly, voice low. "And the ripple doesn't stop at the café. This teaches more than the boys. It teaches the community. The silent observers, even those who think they're irrelevant." Bob nodded again. "Exactly. People often underestimate the power of observation and quiet strength." Outside, a car door slammed. The late-morning street noise pressed against the windows, but inside the cafe remained suspended in a bubble of awareness. The teens finally shuffled toward the exit, each step tentative, measured, faces pale. Emily exhaled the tension, easing slightly, though her hands were still taut on the counter. Bob lifted his cup, a faint steam curling upward, catching the sunlight. "Respect," he said softly, "is not assumed. It is reclaimed. Every choice, every hesitation, every act recorded in the mind, carried forward. And today, it was reclaimed." Avery glanced at Frank and Klein. "This morning is more than an incident report," she said. "It's a case study in human behavior, in intervention, in accountability. Document it well." Bob set his cup down slowly, cane tapping lightly against the floor. Marcus and the seals relaxed subtly, yet their eyes remained vigilant, a silent promise that the protection of justice did not waver. From the corner, Tyler lowered his camera lens, capturing the tension and resolution. Emily's shoulders eased slightly, the tremor gone, replaced with resolve. The cafe hummed softly with the rhythm of normal life returning, but everything in it had changed. Every observer, every participant, every silent witness carried a part of the morning with them now. Bob exhaled again, letting the warmth of the coffee seep through his fingers. The lesson had traveled silently but unmistakably from him to everyone present. Marcus stepped back, eyes scanning the room, approving the closure while remaining alert. Claire Whitman, who had lingered near the entrance, nodded at Bob once, understanding without words that the morning had shifted something fundamental in this corner of the city. The door chimed as another customer entered, ordinary and unaware. Bob lifted his coffee again, steady eyes sweeping the room. Presence, authority, courage, respect, quiet, deliberate, undeniable. The ripple had begun traveling far beyond Harborview Coffee House, beyond this street, beyond the city itself, and the echoes would remain long after the sun climbed higher, the wind shifted, and the tables cleared. Bob took one final sip, cane steady. Posture, straight eyes piercing the morning light. Every silent choice, every measured act, every quiet assertion of dignity had carved a mark. The lesson was carried not by loud proclamations, but by quiet, unyielding presence. And in that moment, he allowed himself a faint, satisfied exhale, knowing the ripple would reach farther than anyone in the room could see. The cafe returned to its rhythm, normal, yet changed, carrying the imprint of courage, respect, and human accountability. The late morning sun had fully crested, spilling gold across the streets of Norfolk, painting the brick sidewalks in streaks of light and shadow. Bob Henderson pushed open the door to the cafe once more, cane tapping in rhythm against the floorboards, and felt the weight of the morning linger in the air like a thick fog. Patrons who had stayed on now whispered quietly among themselves, glancing at him with a newfound reverence that hadn't been there before. The barista, a young man named Luke, wiped down the counter hands, shaking slightly, aware that he was witnessing more than a simple morning scene. He was watching authority and integrity claim its space. Marcus Allen, standing near the entrance, caught Bob's subtle nod and stepped forward, adjusting his stance so that it was protective yet unobtrusive. The other SEALs remained near the back eyes, scanning every corner of the cafe, alert, ready, the kind of presence that made even the confident uneasy. Bob's gaze swept across the room, noting the teenagers louched near the doorway, their earlier bravado replaced with visible discomfort and an understanding that the morning's events had altered them profoundly. Emily, now standing behind the counter, with her sleeves rolled up and hands gripping the edge, exhaled slowly. "I never thought I'd feel part of this," she murmured to herself, voice low, but clear, as if acknowledging her own awakening. Her eyes flicked toward Bob, who caught the movement and gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. The cafe, normally a mundane part of her day, had transformed into a theater of human morality and courage. The door jingled again. A man in his late 50s, tall and slender, dressed in a tailored overcoat and carrying a briefcase, stepped inside. He moved with deliberate purpose, eyes scanning the room before settling on Bob. "Mr. Henderson." His voice was low, firm, carrying a weight that made even the lingering teenagers shift uneasily. Bob looked up, recognition flickering across his face. "Mr. Carter," he said, calm and measured, as if he had expected this meeting all along. Detective Carter, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers, stepped closer, the hum of the espresso machine fading into the background. "We've been called here to follow up on this morning's events," Carter said, voice clipped but controlled. "There are reports, witness statements, video footage. We need your account, Mr. Henderson. Detail everything, from the moment the boys entered." Bob set his coffee down carefully, cane resting against his knee, and exhaled slowly, letting the tension in the room settle just slightly before he spoke. "It's not just about the boys," he began, voice calm but carrying authority. "It's about the choices of everyone else in the room. The inaction, the hesitation, the silent consent. Every glance, every delayed reaction, they are part of the story." Marcus stepped closer, lowering his stance slightly to be less imposing but maintaining control. "They saw the lesson, Bob," he said. "It's not about fear. It's about understanding consequence. They will carry it forward." Bob's eyes narrowed briefly. Understanding is fragile. Memory is selective. The lesson needs reinforcement. Emily adjusted her posture, shoulders squared. She knew she would be asked to speak to bear witness. "They mocked him," she said, voice steady now, though the tremor from earlier still lingered. "They laughed at his age, his service, his very presence. I didn't step in fast enough." Her eyes met at Bob's, and in that glance passed a silent acknowledgement of courage and responsibility. The teenagers huddled near the door, shifted uneasily. One muttered, "We didn't realize," but the words faltered under the weight of Marcus's stare. "Intent does not erase impact," Bob said. "Every action leaves a mark. Remember that. Every single choice has consequences, and they ripple farther than you think." Carter nodded pen, hovering over his notebook. "And the SEALs. They intervened after the initial harassment." Bob's gaze swept to Marcus and the others, a subtle nod conveying the coordinated effort without fanfare. "Presence matters," Bob said. "Timing matters. Courage amplifies consequence." Outside the window, the hum of traffic pressed against the glass, but inside the café was suspended in a rare stillness. Patrons and staff alike were absorbing more than words. They were absorbing principle, accountability, and the gravity of human interaction. Bob's eyes flicked across the room once more. "Observation without action is complicity," he said softly, letting the words hang like a weight in the room. Marcus's voice, calm but sharp, filled the space. "The morning isn't resolved yet. Lessons like this don't end when the incident ends. They carry forward. Awareness, reflection, change. These are the ripples." Bob lifted his cup slightly, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. "Visible or invisible presence shapes reality," he said. The barista. Luke exhaled slowly, tension easing, but still palpable. Harold, the manager, straightened slightly, lips pressed together, understanding at last that inaction was part of the lesson. The teenagers' heads bowed, shuffled toward the door, each step heavy with humility. A soft tap at the window drew attention. Tyler, camera in hand, stood outside, capturing the residual tension, the subtle micro-expressions, the human drama unfolding. He adjusted the angle, focusing on the quiet authority of Bob, the watchful SEALs, Emily's newfound courage. This he whispered to himself. This is the story that needs to travel. Claire Whitman, who had been lingering near the entrance, stepped forward subtly. "You've done more than endure," she said to Bob, voice soft but carrying undeniable authority. "You've made them see, and that seeing changes everything." Bob inclined his head. Slightly, lips curving in a faint, measured smile. "It's only meaningful if it ripples outward," he said. The cafe door chimed again as another customer entered, ordinary and unaware. Bob lifted his coffee eyes steady, taking in the rhythm of the room, the residual energy, the lessons now etched into the memory of everyone present. Marcus and the seals relaxed subtly, though their vigilance remained intact. The hum of normal life resumed, but the room had changed. Patrons moved with an unspoken awareness. Emily stood straighter, and even the teenagers carried with them a lesson far heavier than any scolding could convey. The ripple had begun. It would extend beyond these walls, beyond this street, beyond the neighborhood itself. Bob took one final sip of coffee, lukewarm, now Kane steady at his side. Posture, straight eyes catching the morning sunlight. Presence, authority, courage, respect. They had converged here today. Quietly, deliberately undeniable. The world outside would carry the echoes. And with that, he set the cup down, exhaled slowly, and allowed the morning to continue. Knowing the impact of a single deliberate stand would last far longer than anyone could measure. The late afternoon sun dipped low over Norfolk, casting long golden streaks across the pavement and through the cafe windows. Bob Henderson remained at his table, Kane leaning against the side of his chair, coffee cooling in the cup before him. The atmosphere was quieter now, but the intensity of the morning lingered like an aftershock, palpable in the eyes of every patron. Marcus Allen leaned back, slightly still alert, scanning the room with a practiced gaze. The seals remained positioned subtly, their presence almost invisible, yet unmistakably commanding. Emily had returned to her duties, behind the counter, hands. Steady movements, deliberate. She had changed in the space of a few hours, the tremor of fear replaced with a quiet determination. She wiped down the tables with a precision born from nerves, transformed into purpose, occasionally glancing toward Bob, as if seeking guidance, reassurance that the line between witness and participant was now clearer. The three teenagers who had left earlier were now outside, leaning against the brick facade of the building. Their faces were pale eyes, fixed on the street, as if the weight of the morning had been imprinted on their consciousness. They spoke in low, hurried tones, voices carrying the tremor of residual guilt. "I didn't realize," one whispered. The tallest shifted uncomfortably. "We thought it was funny. I never thought it would turn out like that." A distant rumble of engines drew attention. Through the window, a black SUV approached, slowly stopping at the curb. The doors opened, and a figure stepped out, mid-50s, dressed in a dark overcoat, carrying a leather towel. He walked toward the cafe with deliberate steps, scanning the scene before his eyes finally settled on Bob. "Mr. Henderson," he said, calm but with an underlying authority that made the air feel heavier. Bob looked up, a faint crease forming between his brows. "Yes." "Can I help you?" "I'm Lawrence Kane," the man said, voice low, steady, carrying weight without need for volume. "I'm a mediator for the local Veterans Association. I've been following the morning events. I need your account before things escalate further." Bob nodded slowly, taking a measured sip of coffee. "You've seen the footage?" he asked, eyes meeting Lawrence's. "Yes," Lawrence replied. "But I need your perspective, what the cameras cannot capture." Emily felt her chest tighten as she listened. The situation was escalating into something larger than she had anticipated, the café transforming into a nexus of accountability, law, and ethics. Marcus stepped slightly closer to Bob, eyes scanning the room as if preparing for the next move. "Presence alone can shift behavior," he said quietly. "But words, explanation, context, those cement understanding." Bob nodded, letting his gaze sweep the room. The boys acted thoughtlessly. He said, at voice calm but firm. "But the real lesson lies with the witnesses. The bystanders, the staff, the patrons, they made choices too. Choices to act or remain silent. Choices that carry weight beyond these walls." Lawrence scribbled quickly in his notebook, each word deliberate, capturing not just events, but the underlying currents of behavior. From the back of the café, a woman stepped forward. Claire Whitman, owner of a neighboring building, mid-40s, practical yet authoritative in posture, had lingered near the entrance. "Bob," she said quietly, "I've seen enough. But the ripple extends farther than you realize. People notice courage, and sometimes it inspires action far beyond what we can witness directly." Bob inclined his head slightly, the corners of his lips lifting in faint acknowledgement. Outside, the teenagers shifted uneasily, glancing toward the café. Their earlier hubris had been replaced with a quiet introspection. "We didn't know one," whispered again. Marcus's eyes flicked to the window, catching their movement. He didn't speak, but the silent pressure of observation was enough. Each step, each glance, carried lessons deeper than words could convey. Emily adjusted the tray in her hands, stepping forward slightly. "I didn't know how to act," she said, voice steady now. "I froze. But now I see that silence is complicity. I want to help correct that." Bob's gaze softened, a flicker of approval passing through his eyes. "Recognition is the first step. Action is the second. You've begun that path." The café door chimed again, drawing attention. A reporter camera slung over his shoulder stepped inside, cautiously, eyes moving quickly over the room. "So, ma'am, I'm covering the incident outside. Can we get a statement?" Marcus's gaze swept the café, noting every subtle movement, every reaction. Bob lifted his hand slightly, indicating calm. The room held its breath. Bob set his cup down deliberately. "This isn't about spectacle," he said, voice low but carrying weight. "It's about accountability. Observation alone isn't enough. It's action that matters. Today, lessons have begun, but they must extend beyond this room, beyond this street, beyond this city." The reporter nodded, capturing every word. Lens-focused microphone active. Emily exhaled slowly, realizing that the narrative now extended far beyond the café, the city, perhaps even the region. The seals relaxed imperceptibly, still alert but confident in Bob's command of the room. Claire stood near the door, hands clasped, watching the faintest smile on her lips. The teenagers remained near the window, heads lowered, the gravity of their actions reflected in the tension etched into their faces. Lawrence Kane scribbled his last notes, eyes lifting to Bob. "You've transformed an ordinary morning into a lesson no one here will forget," he said quietly. Bob's eyes swept across the room, lingering on Emily Marcus, the patrons, the teenagers. "Visibility matters," he said. "And so does intention. Remember that." Outside, a gust of wind stirred fallen leaves along the sidewalk, rattling against the windows, punctuating the room with the sound of the larger world, the ripple that had begun now extending outward. Emily straightened shoulders back, hands no longer trembling. Marcus and the SEALs exchanged a silent nod, approving the closure while maintaining readiness. Bob took one final sip of coffee, lukewarm, now feeling the warmth in his hands. The lesson had been transmitted. Presence, courage, accountability, respect. Each participant carried a part of it with them, now etched into memory, into understanding, into action. The café resumed its rhythm, normal yet indelibly changed. The door chimed again as another customer entered. Bob lifted his cup, eyes steady. Presence, authority, courage, respect. They had converged here today, deliberate, undeniable, impossible to ignore. The morning's ripple had begun, and nothing within the walls of Harborview Coffee House nor the street outside could undo it. Bob placed his cup down, slowly exhaled, and allowed the morning to continue. Certain that the lesson would extend far beyond what anyone in the room could yet see. The afternoon sun slanted through the cafe windows, casting long, sharp streaks across the hardwood floors and highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. Bob Henderson sat quietly, Kane resting against the side of his chair, eyes tracing the patterns of sunlight and shadow. The cafe had returned to its ordinary rhythm, yet the energy of the morning lingered palpable, vibrating through every corner of the room. Marcus Allen stood near the entrance, posture relaxed but alert, eyes scanning for any sign of disruption, any flicker that might indicate lingering tension. The other SEALs remained strategically positioned, their presence a quiet assurance that no further mischief would go unchecked. Emily wiped down the counter, slowly, deliberately. Her hands steady. Shoulders squared, a faint glow of newfound confidence threading through her movements. The events of the morning had shifted something deep within her, a realization that courage and action were not the same, and that even a quiet act of bravery could resonate far beyond the immediate moment. She glanced at Bob, who acknowledged her with a subtle nod, the weight of unspoken understanding passing between them. The teenagers who had lingered near the entrance after their earlier confrontation now sat on the curb outside, shoulders hunched, faces pale. Their conversation was low, fractured by intermittent glances toward the cafe, uncertainty threading through every word. I didn't mean for it to get like that," muttered the shortest, eyes darting nervously. The tallest one shook his head, swallowing hard. "We thought it was just a joke. We didn't realize." He trailed off as a gust of wind rattled a nearby lamppost, the sound echoing like punctuation over his hesitation. Bob's gaze followed the teenagers briefly, then returned to the cafe. He exhaled slowly, letting the tension within him dissipate just slightly. "It's never just a joke," he murmured, voice low, but steady. "Every action carries consequence, even in silence. What you perceive as harmless is often a reflection of what is ignored." Marcus Allen, standing behind him, inclined his head subtly. understanding the weight of every word, the underlying lesson in presence, patience, and observation. A bell chimed as the door opened, drawing attention. A woman in her early 50s, wearing a tailored coat and carrying a large leather bag, stepped inside cautiously. Her eyes swept the room, registering the seals, the lingering tension, and finally resting on Bob, Mr. Ho-ho-ho. "Henderson?" she asked, voice controlled, but carrying authority. Bob looked up, nodding faintly. "Yes." "Can I help you? I'm Evelyn Grant," the woman said, stepping forward. "I manage several local community programs. I've been following this morning's events, and I thought you might want to discuss them privately. There are concerns that need addressing before this escalates further." Bob's eyes narrowed, measuring her tone. "Concerns?" he asked, voice calm, deliberate. "About what?" Evelyn paused, glancing at Marcus and the seals, before meeting his gaze fully. "About the wider implications," she said. "The way bystanders behave. The way actions are perceived. The way lessons are reinforced or ignored." Emily exhaled quietly, the faint tremor she had carried all morning, gone now, replaced with steady awareness. The café was a stage, the actors each aware of the gravity of their roles, and she realized her participation was no longer peripheral. It was necessary. Marcus moved slightly, his hand brushing near the grip of his belt, signaling readiness without aggression. Bob's eyes followed the subtle movement, noting the silent assurance it provided. Lawrence Kane, the mediator who had arrived earlier, stepped forward, adjusting his notebook. "We need to capture the sequence accurately," he said, voice low but insistent. "Not just what was seen, but what was experienced. Every hesitation, every glance, every subtle choice matters." Bob inclined his head, lips pressed together. "Then observe carefully," he said. "Because the lesson doesn't end when the morning does. The impact continues long after." Outside, the teenagers shifted nervously, whispering to each other, their earlier arrogance dissipated into self-conscious awareness. One of them muttered, "I can't believe it. We didn't think it would matter this much." Marcus's eyes flicked toward the window, noting the movement. He didn't speak, but the silent weight of observation pressed upon the boys, like gravity teaching a lesson no words could replicate. Emily stepped forward from behind the counter, voice steady now. "I know I hesitated earlier," she said, "but I've seen what inaction can do. It allows disrespect to flourish. I want to ensure that doesn't happen again." Bob's gaze softened, slightly approving. "Recognition is the first step," he said. "Action is the second. And your presence here now is the bridge between the two." Claire Whitman, still standing near the entrance, observed quietly. "You've done more than endure," she said softly to Bob. "You've made the people here see. And seeing changes behavior often in ways they cannot yet comprehend." Bob allowed a faint nod, acknowledging the weight of her words. The cafe door opened once more, and a man with a camera, Tyler, stepped inside cautiously, lens focused on the scene. "I'm documenting the morning," he said quietly. "Not for spectacle, but to capture accountability and awareness. People need to understand what was observed and what was chosen to be ignored." Bob looked at him, expression measured. "Then record carefully," he said. "Because memory is fragile, and perception shapes the lessons that travel beyond this room." The seals relaxed imperceptibly, confident that Bob's presence and the collective awareness of the moment had established the necessary authority. The teenagers remained near the doorway, heads bowed, silently absorbing the magnitude of the lesson they had inadvertently catalyzed. The patrons whispered softly among themselves, acknowledging that something had shifted within the room, within the café, and within themselves. Bob set his coffee down deliberately, letting the warmth dissipate as he addressed the space around him. "Presence matters," he said, voice low but resonant. "Action matters, and the courage to remain steady in the face of disrespect is what changes the narrative." Marcus's eyes flicked towards him, approving the measured authority Bob projected. Evelyn Whitman stepped closer, notebook poised, absorbing the nuances that even cameras could not capture. The sunlight shifted again, highlighting the café in stark lines and shadows. The room held its quiet electricity, the stillness imbued with tension, awareness, and understanding. Emily straightened, shoulders back, hands no longer trembling. Tyler lowered his camera, capturing the subtle interactions, the unspoken communication, the ripple effects of presence and authority. Bob lifted his coffee once more, savoring the lukewarm liquid, the weight of the morning settling into a tangible calm. Marcus stepped back slightly, eyes scanning, approving closure while remaining vigilant. Claire Whitman nodded subtly from the doorway, acknowledging that the lesson had extended beyond immediate participants. The door chimed again, as another customer entered, ordinary, unaware, bringing with them the hum of the outside world. Bob took a slow sip of coffee, eyes steady, scanning the café. Presence, authority, courage, and respect had converged today, deliberate, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. The ripple had begun. It would extend far beyond these walls, far beyond the street and into the city itself. Bob set the cup down, slowly, exhaled deliberately, and allowed the afternoon to continue, knowing the impact of a single, steadfast stand would resonate far longer than anyone in the room could yet measure. The sky had turned a muted orange, late afternoon sun, cutting sharp lines across the streets of Norfolk. Bob Henderson sat near the window cane, resting against his chair, eyes tracing the long shadows stretching across the hardwood floor. The café had settled into a quiet rhythm, the hum of the espresso machine and the low murmur of patrons providing a steady backdrop. Yet the energy in the room was far from ordinary. The events of the morning and early afternoon had left a residual tension, a sense that something significant had occurred, and that it would linger far longer than the day itself. Marcus Allen stood near the entrance, notebook in hand, scanning the room with his trained gaze. Every subtle movement, every twitch of a patron's eye, every quiet shift in posture was catalogued, noted, understood. The other seals maintained positions near the back, their presence subtle, yet unmistakably commanding. Bob's eyes swept across them, measuring their attention, the silent agreement that nothing would disrupt this morning's hard-won equilibrium. Emily adjusted a tray of cups behind the counter, her movements precise, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The confidence she had gained over the course of the morning radiated in her posture, in the steady set of her shoulders, in the controlled way she placed each cup back on the counter. She glanced briefly at Bob, who acknowledged her with a faint nod. The unspoken communication between them, a recognition of shared understanding, mutual respect, and quiet strength. Outside, the three teenagers who had caused the morning's disruption lingered near the building's corner, Their expressions were pale eyes, the weight of accountability pressing on them. One whispered voice, low, barely audible. I didn't realize. The tallest among them shook his head, swallowing hard. We thought it was just a joke, he muttered. The words trailed off as a gust of wind rattled the window, drawing their attention to the consequences of their actions. The door chimed again, and a middle-aged man entered, purposeful in his movements, carrying a black leather folder. His eyes scanned the room, and they settled on Bob. Mr. Henderson. His voice carried authority, calm but heavy with intent. Bob looked up, recognition flickering across his lined face. Yes, he said. Can I help you? I'm Richard Talbot. The man replied, voice low and deliberate. I oversee community outreach for veterans. I've been informed of the incident here today, and I need your account before this escalates further. Bob's gaze lifted steady and unflinching. Account of what he asked. Richard adjusted his folder. Of what happened, what you observed, what you felt. The report we received is only one perspective. Emily shifted, glancing at Marcus. Her hands gripped the tray, tighter knuckles whitening, and she realized that the café had become something far larger than a place to serve coffee. It was a stage, and every observer, every participant, was part of the lesson being enacted. Marcus inclined his head, slightly silent affirmation of Emily's understanding. Bob exhaled slowly, letting the room absorb the calm before he spoke. The boys acted without thinking. He said, voice low, but carrying unmistakable authority. But the true lesson lies with those who observed and did not act. The barista froze. The manager hesitated. Patrons pretended to be distracted. Inaction amplifies disrespect. Richard's pen moved quickly across his notebook, capturing every nuance. Marcus stepped forward, slightly lowering his stance, but maintaining a commanding presence. They learned today, he said quietly. The boys, the bystanders. The lesson is in seeing consequences unfold. Presence alone shifts behavior, but words and actions cement understanding. From the back of the café, Claire Whitman stepped forward, her expression calm but resolute. Bob, she said softly, you've turned a simple incident into a demonstration. The ripple effect is far beyond what anyone can immediately perceive. Courage and quiet observation inspires action where it might not have existed. Bob inclined his head, faintly lips pressing together. Observation without resolve is wasted. Presence without clarity is just motion. Today we combined both. Outside, the teenagers shifted their eyes, darting toward the café, as if the weight of authority pressed from within. One whispered again, voice trembling. We didn't know. Marcus's gaze met theirs, quiet but unyielding. No words were needed. The silent pressure of attention was enough to reinforce the lesson. Emily stepped forward, voice low but firm. I froze, she admitted. I didn't know how to respond. But I understand now that silence can be complicity. I want to act differently in the future. Bob's gaze softened, approving just slightly. Recognition is only the first step. Action must follow. And your presence here speaking ensures that the lesson carries forward. Richard Talbot nodded, adjusting his folder. "We'll need statements from staff, witnesses, and the teenagers," he said. "Every perspective matters, every hesitation, every choice." Bob's eyes met Marcus's. "Then observe carefully," he said, "because perception shapes consequences far beyond what is seen." A soft tap at the window drew attention. Tyler, camera in hand, had returned to capture the subtle interactions, the unspoken lessons, the ripple of consequence spreading through the room. He adjusted the lens, focusing on Bob's quiet authority, the attentive seals, Emily's courage, the tension lingering over the teenagers. "Every small detail matters," Tyler whispered to himself. The seals relaxed subtly, knowing that their presence alone had stabilized the environment. The teenagers remained near the doorway, heads bowed, internalizing the lessons their earlier mischief had precipitated. Patrons whispered among themselves, the café now a crucible in which the principles of respect, courage, and accountability had been forged and observed. Bob set his coffee down deliberately, letting the heat dissipate, and addressed the room with quiet authority. Presence matters, action matters, and standing firm in the face of disrespect is how the narrative changes. Marcus's eyes flicked to him, affirming the truth of the statement. The sunlight shifted again, creating stark lines and shadows across the room. The energy in the café felt alive, potent, carrying lessons far beyond the immediate space. Emily's shoulders were square hands, steady, her confidence now palpable. Tyler lowered his camera, capturing the subtle shifts of understanding, the way courage had traveled from one person to another, silently but undeniably. Bob lifted his coffee, savoring the warmth, as he reflected on the morning and afternoon's events. The ripple had begun. Presence, authority, respect, courage. They had converged in this space deliberately, undeniably, and the echoes would continue beyond the café walls, down the street, and into the wider community. He set the cup down, slowly exhaling with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The lesson had traveled. Its impact would unfold in ways that no one could yet measure. The café returned to its routine, ordinary, yet indelibly changed. The presence of integrity, courage, and accountability remained unspoken but unmistakable, and Bob Henderson knew that the morning's ripple was only beginning. The sun was lowering toward the horizon, painting the streets of Norfolk in gold and amber, the light catching the edges of the café windows and glinting across the polished hardwood floors. Bob Henderson sat at his usual table, the worn leather of his chair creaking softly as he adjusted his posture. His cane leaned against the table leg, fingers resting lightly on its handle. Steady, deliberate. The morning's events had left ripples in the room, echoes of authority, courage, and accountability still vibrating in the air. Marcus Allen stood near the entrance notebook, closed now, pen-clipped eyes, sweeping the café one last time before he leaned back against the wall. The other seals were relaxed but alert, their presence a subtle reminder that vigilance did not fade with time. Emily moved quietly behind the counter, setting down a tray with practiced care, shoulders squared, hands steady. The tremor that had accompanied her earlier had vanished, replaced with a poised confidence that spoke of lessons internalized and courage earned. Outside, the teenagers who had instigated the morning's disruption lingered at the curb. Faces pale, shoulders hunched, as if the weight of their actions pressed on them even now. The tallest one shifted, glancing through the window at Bob, Marcus, and the seals. "We didn't realize," he murmured to his companions, The smallest whispered, "We messed up." Their bravado had been dissolved into humility, a quiet recognition of accountability that could not be undone. The cafe door chimed again, and a figure in a navy overcoat entered. Claire Whitman, mid-40s. Eyes, sharp movements, deliberate, stepped forward, her gaze taking in the room, the patrons, the lingering tension, and finally settling on Bob. "You've managed to turn this morning into a lesson that will carry beyond these walls," she said, quietly. Voice firm, but warm. "Your presence, patience and authority have transformed a simple cafe into a classroom for those willing to learn." Bob inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the weight of her words. Emily glanced at Claire, then at Bob, feeling the significance of the moment settle around her. It was no longer just a cafe. It had become a stage where integrity, respect, and courage had been demonstrated in their purest form. Patrons shifted, some whispering to themselves, some nodding subtly, each processing the morning and afternoon differently, but all touched by the unspoken message. Marcus spoke quietly to Bob, voice low but steady. "The ripple will continue. People saw courage, authority, and patience. They will carry it forward in ways they don't yet understand." Bob's eyes scanned the room, noting subtle nods, slight shifts in posture, the way patrons' eyes lingered longer on Emily, on the seals on him. Each small observation a testament to the impact of deliberate presence. A gust of wind rattled the cafe door, and Tyler, camera in hand, stepped closer, capturing the final moments of the day. His lens focused not on spectacle, but on subtlety. The quiet authority in Bob's posture, the attentive readiness of the seals. Emily's controlled poise, the humility etched into the teenagers' faces. "It will travel," he whispered, adjusting the focus beyond this room, beyond this street, beyond this city. Bob lifted his coffee one final time, warmth radiating through his hands, inhaling deeply the aroma and the gravity of the day. "Presence matters," he said. Voice low but resonant. "Action matters. Courage matters. And the quiet acknowledgement of what is right can change everything around you." Marcus nodded subtly, approving the measured weight of his words. Claire stepped closer, placing a hand briefly on Bob's shoulder. "You've done more than endure," she said softly. "You've made them see, and seeing changes behavior often in ways that extend far beyond what we can witness directly." Bob's lips curved slightly in a faint smile, approval threading through the lines of his face. Observation without understanding is empty. Presence without purpose is fleeting. Today the two converged. The cafe was still alive with quiet electricity. Patrons, employees, and visitors alike were subtly altered their perceptions, shifted their awareness, heightened. Emily straightened shoulders, firm hands resting lightly on the counter. Tyler lowered his camera, satisfied that he had captured not just the event, but the lessons embedded in every glance, every posture, every measured motion. The teenagers finally began to move heads, bowed footsteps, tentative, yet deliberate. Marcus's gaze followed them briefly, before returning to Bob. "They'll carry this with them," he said. "And perhaps in time they'll act differently for themselves and for others." Bob nodded, the lines of his face softening for a moment as he absorbed the affirmation. Outside, the wind shifted again. leaves rustling across the sidewalk, carrying the subtle echoes of the morning. The cafe door chimed one last time as a new customer entered, unaware of the layered history that had just unfolded. Bob took a deliberate sip of coffee, eyes steady scanning the room, the street beyond the city, stretching outward. Presence, authority, courage, and respect had converged here today, deliberate, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. The ripple of the morning now expanded through observation, reflection, and acknowledgement, was no longer confined to the walls of Harborview Coffee House. It extended beyond touching each person who had witnessed it, each person who had internalized it, and would continue outward into the larger world. Marcus Seals, Claire, Emily, Tyler, and even the teenagers had become part of that force, whether consciously or not, a testament to the power of integrity and deliberate action. Bob set his cup down, slowly, exhaled deliberately, and allowed the afternoon to settle. The cafe returned to its rhythm, normal in appearance, but irrevocably changed. Patrons moved quietly, the lessons of accountability and presence lingering in their awareness. The wind carried the faint sound of traffic and distant city life, a reminder that the world outside continued, but now with subtle echoes of the morning's events. Emily straightened fully, a sense of purpose in her movements, understanding that she had been part of something that would resonate far beyond her role behind the counter. Tyler adjusted his camera one final time, noting the subtleties, the quiet shifts in posture, the unspoken communications that carried lessons invisible to the casual observer, but indelibly etched in those who were paying attention. Bob Henderson rose slowly, cane in hand, posture erect, eyes steady. The sunlight framed him against the backdrop of the cafe, a figure of measured authority, quiet courage, and unwavering principle. Marcus and the Seals stepped back, their mission complete, but their presence a lasting reassurance, a silent sentinel in the background. Claire Whitman nodded once, subtly. Acknowledgement and respect threaded through the gesture. The teenagers moved on, stepping carefully onto the street, the weight of accountability tempered by awareness now shaping their actions and perceptions. Patrons returned to their routines. Conversations resumed, but the atmosphere carried a subtle, unmistakable shift, the imprint of courage, respect, and presence. Bob took one final glance around the cafe, lips curling into a faint smile, then lowered his eyes to the cup before him. The lesson had traveled, carried in the awareness of those present, in the observations of those recording, in the ripples of the city outside. Presence mattered. Courage mattered. Respect mattered. Integrity mattered more than anyone had anticipated. He lifted the cup once more, inhaled the faint